Welcome back to our study of the book of Romans. We're going to look at the integrity of the book of Romans, the purpose of the book of Romans, as we continue our introduction to the book. At least 2 chapters of Romans are considered to be problematic in the integrity of the book. That is chapters 15 and 16. Because those chapters, 16 has been considered to be in whole or in part a portion perhaps of an epistle sent to Ephesus, but this is not necessarily the conclusion of the matter, because even though Paul had never been to Rome, by the way, just a lot of the people that are greeted in the end of the book of Romans are also associated with the church at Ephesus. So many people believe that perhaps the end of the book of Romans really belonged to the end of the book of Ephesians, which has no greetings whatsoever, even though Paul was very familiar with that church. And so that becomes a problem both in Ephesians and in Romans. Here's the major issue, though. We don't have any extant copies of Ephesians that contains the end of the book of Romans, and there are very few copies of the book of Romans that leave off the greetings in chapters 15 and 16. So even though Paul had never been to Rome, he sent greetings to a large number of people there. And it would have been more reasonable if they were people from Ephesus, since he had spent 3 years in Ephesus. Also, Paul does not mention these people from his later epistles that had been sent from Rome. But Paul never concludes letters to churches which he personally knows with long addresses. Rather, he only does this to the letter to Colossae, church he had never visited, and of course here in Romans. This would have commended Paul well to the church, since many knew him. In other words, Paul's name dropping. He's writing to a church he's never met, and he's making sure that they know that he knows people that they know, right? He's making those associations, those connections. When he writes to the Ephesians, he can't name everybody that he knows in the book of in Ephesus. The list would be too long. It wouldn't be just 37 names. It would be hundreds of names. And so it makes more sense to greet more people at churches that he doesn't know than churches that he does know. Paul probably does not mention these Romans in any of his other letters because there was no occasion to. They were not his closest workers like Timothy or Luke. And they had no connection with the other churches with which he later wrote to. It is unlikely that Priscilla and Aquila, another statement here, is that it's unlikely that Priscilla and Aquila would have moved from Ephesus back to Rome and then back to Ephesus again. So we know that in 1 Corinthians 16 and in Acts chapter 16 tells us that Priscilla and Aquila had come from Rome and moved to Ephesus. And the question is would they have moved back to Rome and then back to Ephesus again? In 1 Corinthians 16, he greets them in Rome. And so why would they have gone back to Ephesus? But extraordinary travel facilities connected to and from the capital at Rome. Priscilla and Aquila may have been well off and even had a business established in both cities, so they could have gone back and forth all the time. In Romans 16:5, the calling of Epaenetus, the first convert to Christ from Asia, would have been more meaningful in Ephesus than in Rome, people say. But Epaenetus did go to Rome. If he did go to Rome, it would be natural for Paul to greet him there and to mention that he would naturally remember that he was the first convert in Asia. If Paul was unknown to the church at Rome, then his recommendation of Phoebe would have been of little value, another accusation. But this is not necessary to a conclusion, since Paul was not an obscure person, and the writing of his letter speaks of a level of his authority with the Romans, which we'll get to in a little bit. The warnings in chapter 16 appear to be more around the antinomianism that perhaps was founded in Ephesus than the Jewish-Gentile controversy in Rome, another accusation. While there's no mention of these problems among the Romans, this does not mean that these words would have no relevance to them, especially in view of Paul's own struggles with this throughout his ministry. Another accusation, chapter 16 may have been a later appendix to the conclusions stated in chapter 15, but the ending in 1533 is without precedent among Paul's letters. In other words, it doesn't sound like a lot of Paul's letters. In fact, the greeting at the end of chapter 16, many have put, many manuscripts actually puts earlier in the book at the end of chapter 14, which we'll get to when we get to the exposition of those chapters. We'll look at it there. All right. Therefore, the evidence is inconclusive that chapter 16 should have belonged to the Ephesian letter. If there was an Ephesian letter, why did only its greetings survive? And why would they be attached to the book of Romans? And there's no manuscript to support that Romans ever circulated without this concluding chapter. All right. All right. So the enormity of textual evidence indicates that the letter did circulate with a shorter recension, in other words, contracted. Although it's a difficult issue, it was probably originally a longer letter that was shortened by Marcion, a much later believer, and then copied by scribes who did not know of his editing of it. When the final chapters were found, they were added without editing the doxology at the end of chapter 15. In other words, there is some complications to the textual, but rest assured, what we have is exactly what Paul intended for us to have. So the question then, why did Paul write Romans? Let's go with a couple of different things that we're going to take straight from the text. First, Paul planned to do missionary work in Spain, chapter 15, verses 24 to 28, and thus visit the Romans for prayer and financial support on his way to Spain. Right? Paul was interested in the Roman church and intended to come there for many years. This is evident several times in the book. Chapter 1, verse 13, several times in chapter 15, and also we see it in Acts chapter 19, where he indicates that he's going to go on to Rome after his trip to Jerusalem, where he wanted to go to Rome even before he left for Jerusalem. Paul wanted to preach the gospel and impart spiritual benefits to the Roman believers. We see that again, chapter 1, verses 11 and 15. Since the book has so many doctrines, Paul wanted to instruct the Romans in their faith. Perhaps Phoebe was on her way to Rome, and it was a good opportunity for him to send the letter with her. Some have suggested that that this was Paul's magnum opus, that this was ultimately Paul's declaration of the gospel. And many parts of the book of Romans very well could have been composed while he was in Ephesus during his 2 or 3 year stay there, while he was really working on this treatise, and then compiled together for this purpose of sending this letter to Rome. So the purpose then, to create an interest in Paul's Spanish mission. However, this does not account adequately for the theological nature. Obviously, there's a small portion of it that's in there. To present a full statement of Paul's doctrinal position of the gospel, making this more of a treatise than a letter, which arose from some historical situation. Right? Paul writes to address certain intellectual questions, especially concerning the place of a universal religion over against Jewish nationalism, which the saints in Rome are concerned about. See, what happened was, and this is let's get into this a little more, is the historical situation that's going on. All right, in AD 50 to 51, Rome was under the rule of Claudius. Claudius, because of a dispute between the Jews of his day in the city of Rome, Jews that lived in the city of Rome, ended up kicking out the Jews from Rome. He expelled all the Jews from Rome. Now, it doesn't say that he expelled any Christians, but just the Jews. We see in Acts chapter 16, Priscilla and Aquila had recently come from Rome because of this expulsion. By the time the book of Romans was written, those Jews had been allowed to return. Now think of this situation, because here's what the problem is. In Rome, there was a Jewish and Gentile church predominantly ruled over by Jews. in the city of Rome. May have been a very small church. Most of it was probably from converts, either from Paul's missionary journeys, or that had migrated to Rome, or perhaps we see in Acts chapter 2 that there were Jews, in Jerusalem during the Feast of Pentecost, during Peter's sermon. Some came to faith and then went back to Rome. So the original church in Rome was Jewish. When you remove those Jews out of Rome under Claudius, you're left with a purely Gentile church. So when those Jews come back to Rome, they're going to expect that the leadership positions and positions of honor in the church would belong to them. That creates a problem in Rome of contention between the Jews and Gentiles. Part of I believe, the central focus or central problem that Paul is there to address. The question, has God left Israel alone? Has God abandoned Israel and his promises to Israel and exclusively gone to the Gentile church? And if that's the case, then why even be a Jew? And we'll see that as we get into the exposition throughout our study.